A delayed flight, a crowded gate, a simple, misplaced piece of paper. For most people, it's an inconvenience. For Dr. Elias Vance, it became a stage for his own public humiliation. Dressed in a worn hoodie and jeans, he was seen as nothing more than a problem, a target for the venom of a gate agent on a power trip. But neither she, nor her smirking manager, nor the arrogant CEO of Ascend Air knew who they were dealing with. They couldn't possibly imagine that their casual cruelty towards one unassuming black passenger would unleash a corporate hurricane, a storm of financial ruin that would not only cost them their jobs, but obliterate their entire company from the sky. This is the story of how a single act of prejudice grounded an airline forever. A story that proves the quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. The air in Terminal C of Northwood International Airport was thick with the familiar cocktail of human impatience and industrial disinfectant. It was a symphony of controlled chaos, the rhythmic beeping of baggage carts, the distant drone of jet engines, and the overlapping murmur of 1,000 conversations, all punctuated by the crisp, disembodied voice of the gate announcer. For Dr. Elias Vance, it was just noise, a background hum to the quiet focus of his thoughts. He sat hunched over a worn paperback, its spine broken and its pages soft with use, a stark contrast to the sleek, glowing screens that surrounded him. He was a man who deliberately defied categorization. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie, the fabric softened by years of washing a pair of dark, well-worn denim jeans and scuffed leather boots, he could have been anyone. A graduate student heading home for the holidays, a musician on his way to a gig, a construction worker catching a red-eye. There was nothing about his appearance that screamed wealth or influence. His face, etched with the faint lines of deep thought rather than age, was calm and observant. His eyes, dark and intelligent, missed nothing, taking in the frantic energy of the terminal with a placid, almost academic curiosity. This anonymity was a cloak he wore by choice, a shield against the presumptions and expectations that came with his real life. His flight, Ascend Air 482 to Denver, was delayed. First by 30 minutes, then by an hour now, by an indefinite technical issue. The initial groans of the passengers had long since subsided into a resigned lethargy. Elias didn't mind. The delay gave him more time to read, more time to simply be a person in a sea of people, untethered from the crushing responsibilities that awaited him. He was flying to Denver not for a board meeting or a multi-billion-dollar acquisition, but to visit Dr. Peterson, his old physics professor from his undergraduate days. The man who had first seen the spark of genius in a quiet, intense young student and fanned it into a flame. It was a pilgrimage of gratitude, one he made every couple of years, and he always flew coach on a budget airline like Ascend. It kept him grounded, he told himself, a reminder of a life before private jets and curated realities. The announcement finally came, a crackle of static followed by the news that Gate C12 was now boarding. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the waiting area. People began to stir, gathering bags, rustling jackets, and forming the inevitable disorderly queue. Elias carefully placed his worn bookmark, a simple folded receipt, into his book, slid it into his backpack, and stood up, stretching his legs. He slung the backpack over one shoulder and joined the end of the line, his place secured in Zone 4. He shuffled along with the crowd, pulling out his phone and wallet from his hoodie pocket to prepare. He found his driver's license easily enough, but his fingers fumbled for the flimsy paper boarding pass the kiosk had printed out earlier. It wasn't there. He patted the other pocket. Nothing. A small cold knot began to form in his stomach. He stepped out of the line, letting a family with 2 noisy children pass him, and began a more systematic search. He checked the front pouch of his backpack, then the main compartment, sifting through his book, a notebook, and a charging cable. Still nothing. He retraced his steps in his mind. He'd printed the ticket at the kiosk, walked to the coffee shop, bought a black Americano, then found this seat. He must have set it down somewhere. He scanned the area where he'd been sitting, but the seats were already occupied by a new wave of passengers for a different flight. The boarding pass was gone. It was an annoyance, nothing more. They could surely look him up by his name or confirmation number. He waited patiently as the line thinned, finally approaching the gate desk. 2 agents were working. One was a young man who looked bored and exhausted. The other was a woman in her late 40s, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to tighten the skin around her eyes. Her name tag read Cynthia Rowe. Her smile was a thin, painted-on line that didn't reach the coldness in her eyes. She was scanning passports with a brisk, impatient efficiency, her every movement radiating an air of weary authority. It was to her that Elias was unfortunately directed. "Good evening," Elias said, his voice calm and even. "My apologies. I seem to have misplaced my paper boarding pass. I have my ID and my confirmation number, if that helps." He offered his driver's license. Cynthia did not look at the ID. Her eyes flickered over Elias's hoodie, his worn jeans, and settled on his face with a look of profound skepticism. "Sir, you need a boarding pass to board the plane," she stated, her tone flat and patronizing, as if explaining a complex concept to a small child. "I understand that," Elias replied, keeping his voice level. "I'm saying that I had one and I've lost it. I was hoping you could reprint it for me. The name is Elias Vance. Flight 482 to Denver." Cynthia sighed a theatrical exhalation of manufactured frustration. She tapped a few keys on her terminal with long, lacquered nails, her movements deliberately slow. "Vance," she muttered, not looking at him. "I don't have time for this. We are in the final boarding process. You should have been more careful with your documents." The accusation in her tone was sharp and unwarranted. Elias felt a familiar, weary tightening in his chest. He had encountered people like Cynthia Rowe his entire life, individuals who wielded their tiny slivers of power like weapons, who made snap judgments based on packaging rather than content. It was a simple mistake, Elias said, his voice still quiet, but now with a firmer edge. "If you could just look up the name, I'm sure you'll find my reservation. I have the confirmation email on my phone as well." He started to pull out his phone. "Sir, put the phone away." She snapped, her painted-on smile completely gone now. "Everyone thinks they have a reservation. I need to see a boarding pass. That is the procedure. Now please step aside and let the paying customers with their documents in order get on the plane." The words "paying customers" hung in the air, a deliberate insult designed to humiliate. The implication was clear. Elias felt the eyes of the remaining passengers on him. He saw pity in some, annoyance in others. He was now an obstacle, a problem holding up the line. The quiet anonymity he cherished had been shattered, replaced by a harsh, unwanted spotlight. The storm had not yet broken, but the air had turned electric, charged with the bitter ozone of prejudice and disrespect. And Elias Vance, a man who could buy and sell the entire airline without checking his bank balance, stood there being publicly shamed over a 5-cent piece of paper. The humiliation was a physical sensation, a flush of heat that crept up Elias's neck. It wasn't the anger of a man whose pride was wounded, but the deep, bone-weary frustration of a man who had faced this same tired script too many times before. The presumption of guilt, the immediate dismissal, the subtle acid-laced condescension that dripped from Cynthia Rowe's every word. It was a language he understood all too well. "Ma'am, my name is Elias Vance," he repeated, his voice low and steady, a deliberate counterpoint to her rising agitation. He refused to be baited into an emotional reaction. That was what people like her wanted. It would, in their minds, justify their behavior. "I am a paying customer. I have a ticket. I have a seat assigned to me on that aircraft. All I am asking is for you to perform a basic function of your job and look up my reservation so you can reprint the pass." He held her gaze, his dark eyes unwavering. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesticulate. He simply stood there, a pillar of calm reason against her wall of bureaucratic hostility. This placid refusal to be rattled seemed to infuriate her more than any outburst could have. "Don't you take that tone with me," she hissed, leaning forward over the counter. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow louder and more piercing than a shout. "I know your type. You think you can just show up, cause a scene, and get whatever you want. It's not going to happen. Not at my gate." "My type?" Elias asked, one eyebrow arching slightly. The two words were quiet, almost a whisper, yet they landed in the space between them with the force of a gavel. He let the question hang there, forcing her to confront the ugly prejudice she had just revealed. The young male agent at the next counter, who had been trying to ignore the exchange, now glanced over his expression, uneasy. A few passengers still lingering near the gate turned to watch, their curiosity piqued by the escalating tension. Cynthia's face flushed a blotchy red. She had been called out, and she knew it. But instead of retreating, she doubled down, wrapping herself in the protective mantle of corporate policy. "Our final boarding call has been made. I am no longer able to issue new boarding passes. It's against regulations. You've missed your flight." It was a blatant lie, and they both knew it. The jet bridge was still attached, the plane door was open, and the last few passengers were just now shuffling aboard. "That's not true," Elias stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. "We both know you can reprint a pass in less than 30 seconds. My seat is 17B. It will be empty if you don't let me on. That's an inconvenience for me and a loss of revenue, however small, for your airline." His logical, dispassionate argument was like oil on her fire. She saw it as a challenge to her authority, a questioning of her absolute power in this tiny fiefdom of linoleum and fluorescent lights. She straightened up, her expression hardening into a mask of righteous indignation. "That's it. I've had enough of your attitude," she declared, her voice now loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear clearly. "You are being disruptive. I am calling the station manager." She picked up the phone at her desk and spoke into it with a clipped, officious tone. "Robert, I need you at gate C12 immediately. We have a passenger refusing to comply." The words were chosen carefully, twisting his calm requests into a narrative of aggression. Elias simply stood his ground, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, and waited. He had long ago learned that in situations like this, the first person to lose their temper loses everything. His heart beat a steady, rhythmic cadence. He was no longer just a man trying to get on a plane. He was an observer in a social experiment he'd been unwillingly cast in. Within 2 minutes, a man in a slightly ill-fitting suit hurried towards the gate. This was Robert Henderson, the station manager. He had the harried look of a mid-level bureaucrat, his face a permanent mask of strained geniality that failed to hide the deep-seated stress in his eyes. He approached the desk pointedly, ignoring Elias and speaking directly to Cynthia. "What's the problem here, Cynthia?" he asked, his voice a forced, placating hum. "This gentleman," she spat the word out, "lost his boarding pass and is demanding I reprint it after final call. He's become aggressive and is holding up the final departure procedures." Henderson finally turned to Elias, his eyes scanning him from head to toe in a quick, dismissive appraisal. The assessment was visible on his face, the worn clothes, the backpack, the quiet black man standing his ground. Henderson's mind was made up before Elias even opened his mouth. He saw a liability, not a customer. Sir Henderson began adopting the patient tone one might use with a difficult child. "I understand you're frustrated, but our agent is just following procedure. If you've missed the check-in window and the final boarding call, there's really nothing we can do at this point." "I haven't missed anything," Elias said, his voice remaining impossibly calm. "I was in the queue before the final call was made. Your agent is refusing to look up my reservation. It's that simple. My name is Elias Vance. My confirmation number is 7G4B2K. All I need is a piece of paper." He provided the information so clearly, so precisely, that it momentarily threw Henderson off his script. For a second, a flicker of doubt crossed the manager's face. This man didn't sound like the belligerent troublemaker Cynthia had described. But a quick glance at Cynthia's thunderous expression and a desire to avoid any further conflict with his staff made him default to his original position. Siding with the employee was always the path of least resistance. "Sir, I'm not going to argue with you," Henderson said, his false patience wearing thin. "Cynthia is one of our most experienced agents. If she says it's too late, then it's too late. I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the gate. We can try to rebook you on a flight tomorrow morning at the main ticketing counter." The injustice of it was staggering. He was being dismissed, erased, not because of a rule, but because of a prejudice. Because it was easier for them to believe he was a problem than to believe their most experienced agent was acting out of pure spite. "You are denying me boarding on a flight for which I have a valid ticket based on the unsubstantiated claim of your employee who refuses to even verify my identity." Elias summarized his words, precise and cold. "Is that the official position of Ascend Air?" The question, phrased with such legalistic clarity, was a trap. Henderson knew it. Admitting to it was an admission of fault. He floundered for a moment. "The official position is that you are being disruptive, sir. The plane needs to depart. The safety and timeliness of our operations is our top priority." "So my timely arrival is not a priority," Elias countered softly. "And asking for a service I am entitled to is considered disruptive." From the back of the small crowd of onlookers, a young man in his early 20s holding a phone watched the scene with wide, incredulous eyes. He wore a startup t-shirt and glasses, and he recognized the man in the hoodie. It couldn't be. Not here flying coach on Ascend Air. But the calm, resonant voice, the unnerving stillness under pressure. It had to be him. The young man Finn had watched dozens of his keynote speeches online. He idolized this man. Without a second thought, he discreetly lifted his phone and pressed record. "This is your final warning," Henderson said, his voice rising, his composure finally cracking. "Step away from the desk now, or I will be forced to call airport security." The threat hung in the air, thick and ugly. Elias looked from Henderson's flustered face to Cynthia's triumphant smirk. He saw the closed door of the jet bridge. He saw the other passengers staring. He had reached the end of this road. He knew there was nothing more he could say that would penetrate their wall of willful ignorance. The confrontation had escalated from an inconvenience to a matter of principle. They hadn't just denied him a seat on a plane. They had denied him his dignity. They had judged him, tried him, and sentenced him in their own petty court, and they had done it with a smile. A heavy silence descended upon the gate area. The last of the passengers had boarded, and the flight attendant at the jet bridge door was looking back at the desk, waiting for a signal. Cynthia Rowe stood with her arms folded, a smug, vindicated look on her face. Robert Henderson, having delivered his ultimatum, puffed out his chest, trying to project an authority he clearly didn't feel. For him, the situation was resolved. He had backed his employee and removed the problem. Elias Vance, however, remained motionless for a long moment. His mind, accustomed to processing complex algorithms and multi-layered investment strategies, was now dissecting this simpler, uglier equation of power and prejudice. He could, of course, make a phone call. One single call to a number on his speed dial, and the CEO of Ascend Air's parent company would be on the other end of the line, stammering apologies. He could unleash a world of trouble on these two small-minded individuals before they even knew what hit them. But that wasn't his way. It was too easy. It was a sledgehammer for a problem that required surgical precision. Reacting with overt power here in this moment would only reinforce their narrative of the aggressive man. The most potent response was not to fight on their level, but to let their own actions be the catalyst for their downfall. He had to let the system they represented expose its own rotten core. He finally broke the silence. "So, to be absolutely clear," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, a surgeon stating a diagnosis, "you are refusing to verify my ticket, denying me boarding, and threatening me with security." He looked directly at Henderson. "I want to hear you say it." Henderson's face twitched. He was being cornered, forced to own the decision. "Sir, I am asking you to leave the gate area. You have missed your flight due to your failure to produce a boarding pass. If you do not comply, you will be considered a security risk." It was a cowardly, evasive answer, and Elias recognized it as such. Henderson was hiding behind the sterile language of security protocols. "I will not leave," Elias stated simply. "Not until one of you makes a good-faith effort to find my reservation in your system. I will stand here quietly and wait." He wouldn't yell, he wouldn't protest. He would just be there. An immovable object of quiet defiance. This was a move they hadn't anticipated. They were prepared for shouting for anger. They were not prepared for this profound, unnerving stillness. Cynthia, her patience completely gone, stepped forward. "That's it. He's trespassing in a secured area," she exclaimed to Henderson. "Call them. Call security now." Henderson, visibly relieved to be given a direct order that absolved him of further thought, pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Henderson at C-12. We have a non-compliant individual refusing to leave the gate, requesting assistance from airport police." As Henderson spoke into the radio, Elias felt a profound sense of disappointment. It had truly come to this. He, Dr. Elias Vance, founder of Oakhaven Capital, a man who sat on the boards of some of the most powerful technology companies in the world, who had personally financed advancements in renewable energy and medical research, was about to be escorted out of an airport terminal like a common criminal. All because he looked a certain way to a woman who judged the world through a pinhole of prejudice. The young man, Finn, was still recording. His hands were trembling slightly. He couldn't believe what he was witnessing. This was Elias Vance, the titan of Silicon Valley, the man whose essays on ethical investment were required reading in his business school. Seeing him treated this way was surreal, like watching a king being berated by a court jester. He made sure to capture the faces of Cynthia and Henderson, their expressions of smug satisfaction and stressed-out impatience. 2 airport police officers arrived within minutes. They were large men, their uniforms crisp, their faces impassive. They assessed the scene, the irate gate agent, the flustered manager, and the calm, well-dressed black man standing alone. They had seen this 100 times. "What seems to be the trouble here?" the older officer asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Henderson immediately launched into his rehearsed narrative. This individual was denied boarding after failing to provide documentation. He refused to leave the gate area after multiple requests. He's causing a security concern. The officer turned to Elias. "Sir, is this true? Are you refusing to leave?" "I am refusing to leave until the airline makes a reasonable attempt to find my paid-for ticket in their system," Elias said calmly. "I have my ID and confirmation number. They refuse to look." The officer sighed. He was caught in the middle. Technically, the gate area was the airline's jurisdiction. If they wanted someone removed, he had to remove them. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this is their operational area. I can't force them to look up your ticket. At this point, it's a customer service issue you'll have to take up at the ticketing desk. Right now, you need to come with us." Elias looked at the officer, then back at Henderson and Cynthia. He saw no path forward here. To resist further would be to cede the moral high ground and descend into a physical confrontation he could not win and did not want. The battle here was over. The war, however, had just begun. With a small, almost imperceptible nod, he relented. "Very well." He picked up his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and turned to follow the officers. As he walked away, the last thing he heard was Cynthia's voice, dripping with saccharine venom, speaking into the gate microphone. "Final paperwork is complete. Ascend Air 482 is now cleared for departure." He didn't look back. He walked with a straight back and a steady gait, flanked by the two officers past the staring faces of other travelers. He was being escorted out of the terminal, a walk of shame that felt more like a march of purpose. They had made their move. Now it was his turn. And his moves were not made on a chessboard of airport gates and petty regulations. They were made on a global scale, with consequences that could shake foundations. Finn stopped recording, his heart pounding. He had it all. The condescension, the lies, the threats. He looked at the video file on his phone. He knew he was holding a bomb. He immediately uploaded it to his cloud storage, then drafted a tweet tagging several major news outlets and tech journalists. He typed out a simple, explosive caption: "Ascend air staff and manager racially profile and eject a passenger for losing his ticket. They have no idea who they just messed with. This is Dr. Elias Vance." He hesitated for only a second before hitting post. The point of no return had been crossed not just for Elias, but for everyone. The walk with the police officers was quiet and surreal. They led Elias not to a holding cell, but to the pre-security area of the main terminal near the ticketing counters. They were professional, almost gentle, as if they sensed this was not a standard case of an unruly passenger. "You can sort it out with the main office over there, sir," the older officer said, gesturing vaguely towards the sprawling Ascend Air check-in area. "They'll be able to rebook you." "Thank you, officers," Elias said, his tone genuine. They had been doing their job pawns in a game started by others. He stood for a moment amidst the ebb and flow of travelers, the cavernous hall amplifying the sounds of rolling suitcases and anxious chatter. He had no intention of going to the ticketing counter. Arguing with another low-level employee to get a seat on a later flight with a company that had just fundamentally disrespected him was a fool's errand. Ascend Air had already received the last dollar they would ever get from him. He walked past the check-in desks and found a quiet corner near a large window overlooking the tarmac. He watched as a plane, likely his plane flight 482, was pushed back from the gate, its lights blinking in the deepening twilight. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching a scene from a movie. He pulled out his phone. He ignored the notifications that were beginning to flood in. Instead, he navigated to his contacts and tapped on a name, Arthur. No last name, no title. No, none was needed. The phone rang twice before it was answered. Elias, I trust you're not calling to tell me you've changed your mind about the Zurich acquisition. The voice on the other end was warm, deep, and carried the easy confidence of old money and earned power. Arthur Pembroke was the chairman of the board of Oakhaven Capital and one of Elias's oldest friends and mentors. Nothing so dramatic, Arthur, Elias said, a hint of dry amusement in his voice. I find myself with an unexpected change of travel plans. I have a small question for you. Who handles the aviation leasing portfolio for the Sterling Infrastructure Group? There was a brief pause. Arthur was sharp enough to know that Elias never asked small questions. That would be us primarily, Arthur replied, his interest piqued. We hold the majority of their debt portfolio. They're leveraged to the hilt, but their assets are solid. They own a fleet of about 200 narrow-body jets leased out to various regional carriers. Why do you ask? Elias watched as Flight 482 began its slow taxi toward the runway. One of their primary lessees is a budget airline called Ascend Air. I've just had a rather illuminating customer service experience with them. Arthur chuckled. Illuminating, Elias, you haven't flown commercial in 15 years. Don't tell me you're out there rubbing shoulders with the proletariat on some flying tin can. I'm visiting my old professor. It keeps me humble, Elias said. Or it's supposed to. Arthur, I want you to initiate a full risk assessment of our position with Sterling specifically as it relates to their exposure to Ascend Air. I want to know their debt-to-asset ratio, their cash flow status, their fuel hedging contracts, everything. I want it on my desk by morning. The playfulness in Arthur's voice vanished, replaced by razor-sharp focus. He knew Elias's tone. This wasn't a whim. This was the prelude to a strategic move. Consider it done. May I ask what prompted this sudden diligence? Let's just say, Elias said, his voice as smooth and cold as polished stone. I've come to believe that a company's culture is a leading indicator of its long-term financial viability. And a culture of arrogance and incompetence starting from the ground up suggests a deep-seated structural rot. I'm no longer confident in the investment. Understood, Arthur said. I'll have the team start immediately. Thank you, Arthur. Elias ended the call. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a threat. He had simply planted a seed of doubt in the most fertile financial soil imaginable. Oakhaven Capital was not just any investment firm. It was a kingmaker, a silent giant whose shifts in sentiment could cause earthquakes in the market. A negative risk assessment from them on a company's primary client would be a catastrophic red flag for any creditor. He had just lit a very long, very slow-burning fuse. Meanwhile, Finn's post was exploding. The video was raw, shaky, and undeniably authentic. The audio clearly captured Cynthia's condescending tone and Henderson's weak, jargon-filled deflections. The caption naming Dr. Elias Vance was the accelerant. Tech journalists who revered Vance as a near-mythical figure pounced on the story. Bloggers and influencers in the finance and travel sectors picked it up. The hashtags Ascend Air Shame and Justice for Vance started trending. The video ricocheted across Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, amassing hundreds of thousands of views within the hour. The court of public opinion was now in session, and the verdict was coming in swift and brutal. 30,000 feet in the air, Harrison Croft, the CEO of Ascend Air, was enjoying a glass of champagne in the first-class cabin of a transatlantic flight. He was returning from a conference in London where he had given a speech about the bright, innovative future of budget air travel. He landed at JFK, switched on his phone, and was met with a tidal wave of notifications. Dozens of urgent emails from his communications team, voicemails from board members. His personal phone was buzzing with texts. He opened the first email from his head of PR. The subject line was Urgent Viral Video Incident, Northwood. He read the email, then clicked the link to the video. He watched the grainy footage of his own employees' faces he vaguely recognized systematically dismantling the dignity of a man in a hoodie. He scoffed. Some guy loses his ticket and throws a tantrum. This is what passes for news, he muttered to his assistant. He called his head of PR a perpetually stressed woman named Amelia. Amelia, what is this garbage? Put out a statement. Standard stuff. We're investigating the incident. We take customer service seriously. This does not reflect our values. Get the social media team to bury it. This will blow over in a day. Sir, Amelia said, her voice strained. It's not that simple. The man in the video, they're saying he's Elias Vance. Croft drew a blank. Who Elias Vance? Should I know him? He's the founder of Oakhaven Capital, sir. Amelia said, her voice barely a whisper. They're one of the most powerful tech and infrastructure investment firms in the world. The champagne suddenly felt sour in Croft's stomach. Oakhaven Capital. The name rang a distant, ominous bell. He couldn't place it immediately, but he knew it was important. Oakhaven. Are they connected to us? I don't know, sir. Amelia confessed. Our finance department is looking into it now, but the story is spreading Harrison. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have already called for comment. Harrison Croft felt a prickle of genuine fear. This was no longer a minor customer service issue. This was a 5-alarm corporate fire. The ripple Elias had started by the window at Northwood International had just crashed against the shores of his own complacent reality. And the tide was still rising. The corporate headquarters of Ascend Air, a soulless glass and steel box in a sprawling Dallas office park, was a place that normally ran on the low hum of air conditioning and the quiet clicking of keyboards. But on this particular evening, it was a hive of frantic, panicked activity. The news of the viral video had swept through the building like a contagion, transforming the usual end-of-day quiet into a state of high alert. In the sterile open-plan office of the Public Relations Department, Amelia was chain-drinking stale coffee, her face illuminated by the glow of a dozen screens, all displaying the same damning video and a waterfall of angry comments. Her team, a group of young, bright social media managers, looked shell-shocked. They were used to dealing with complaints about lost baggage and delayed flights. They were not equipped for a full-blown ethical and financial crisis involving one of the most respected and enigmatic figures in global finance. Kill the comments on our pages, block the hashtags. Amelia ordered, her voice frayed. Draft another statement, something more personal from Harrison. We need to get ahead of this. But it was like trying to dam a tsunami with a handful of sand. For every negative comment they deleted, 100 more appeared. The story had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just about a rude gate agent. It was a parable for corporate arrogance and systemic racism, and Ascend Air was cast as the unambiguous villain. Meanwhile, in the top-floor finance department, a junior analyst named Kevin, tasked with digging into any potential connection to Oakhaven Capital, felt a jolt of ice-cold dread. He wasn't looking at direct investment in Ascend Air. The connection was far deeper and far more dangerous. He stared at the screen, at the complex web of shell corporations and holding companies until the picture became horrifyingly clear. He printed out the documents and ran tie askew to his director's office. "Sir," he said, breathless, "you need to see this." The director, a portly man named Gerald, took the papers annoyed at the interruption. He began to read. His ruddy complexion slowly drained of all color, leaving his face a pasty, sickly gray. "Get me the CEO," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Get him on the phone. Now." The connection was Sterling Infrastructure Group. Ascend Air didn't own its planes. Like most budget carriers, they leased nearly their entire fleet. Their lessor for 80% of their aircraft was Sterling. And Sterling's primary creditor, the entity that held the strings to their massive debt and effectively controlled their financial destiny, was a subsidiary wholly owned by Oakhaven Capital. Dr. Elias Vance didn't have a stake in their airline. He had a stake in the company that owned their airline's ability to fly. He wasn't a passenger they had offended. He was, for all intents and purposes, their landlord, and they had just tried to evict him from his own property. The revelation sent shockwaves up the chain of command, culminating in a hastily arranged conference call with Harrison Croft, who was now stuck in traffic on his way home from JFK, bellowing into his phone. "What do you mean they hold our leases?" Croft yelled. "How did we not know this?" "It's several layers deep, sir." Gerald, the finance director, explained, his voice trembling. "It's all perfectly legal, but the exposure is total. If Oakhaven calls in their notes with Sterling, Sterling will have to immediately recall their assets to cover the debt. They'll have to ground our planes, all of them." The phone went silent for a moment. The magnitude of the disaster was finally sinking in for Harrison Croft. This wasn't about bad press anymore. This was an extinction-level event. "Get me Robert Henderson and the gate agent, Cynthia Rowe," Croft commanded, his voice now dangerously low. "Get them on a video call. I want to see their faces when they explain to me how they single-handedly destroyed this company." Back at Northwood International, Robert Henderson was just finishing his shift. He was feeling rather pleased with himself. He had handled a difficult situation, backed his employee, and avoided a delay. He was in his small, cluttered office filing a report on the incident, painting Elias as the aggressor, when his desk phone rang with the sharp, insistent chirp reserved for calls from corporate. Cynthia Rowe was at home, pouring herself a large glass of cheap Chardonnay, recounting the story to her sister on the phone. "And then I told him, 'Sir, we have procedures,' and he got all huffy. You know the type, so entitled." Her phone buzzed with a message from Henderson, urgent. "Conference call with corporate now. Link to follow." She felt a flicker of annoyance, but also a thrill of importance. The manager had backed her up, and now corporate was probably calling to commend her for her firm handling of the situation. 10 minutes later, they were both on a video call, their faces appearing in small boxes on a large screen in the Dallas boardroom, where Amelia and the finance director had gathered. Harrison Croft's face, projected onto the main screen from his car, was a terrifying mask of fury. "Do either of you have any idea what you have done?" Croft began, his voice a low growl. Henderson, blindsided by the aggression, was immediately on the defensive. "Mr. Croft, sir, I was just following protocol. The passenger was becoming belligerent and—" "Shut up, Robert," Croft snapped. "Just shut your mouth. And you," he said, his gaze shifting to Cynthia's box. "Ms. Rowe. You felt very powerful today, didn't you? Standing there at your little counter playing God with people's travel plans." Cynthia, who had expected praise, was stunned into silence. Her Chardonnay sat forgotten beside her. "The man you threw out of the airport today," Croft continued, his voice rising with every word, "the man you humiliated in front of 100 people was Dr. Elias Vance. He is the founding partner of Oakhaven Capital. Oak Haven Capital holds the debt for the company that owns our planes. All of our planes." The color drained from Cynthia's face. She looked like she might be sick. Henderson's jaw hung open, a comical picture of disbelief and horror. "Because of your breathtaking stupidity," Croft seethed. "Because you couldn't be bothered to type a name into a computer, you have jeopardized this entire airline. Our stock is going to be worthless by morning. Our creditors are going to ground our fleet. Thousands of people are going to lose their jobs. All because you, Cynthia, had a bad day and decided to take it out on the wrong man in a hoodie." The blame game had begun, but it was already over. There was no one else to point to. It was all there on video for the world to see. The two faces on the screen, once so smug and assured, were now the public faces of corporate suicide. They were no longer employees. They were liabilities. "You're both fired, obviously," Croft said, the words dripping with contempt. "Don't bother coming in tomorrow. Security will escort you if you try. Your final paychecks will be mailed to you. Now get off my screen." He terminated the call, leaving Cynthia and Henderson staring at their blank devices, the echoes of their CEO's rage still ringing in their ears. The unmasking was complete. They had picked a fight with a giant, mistaking him for a mouse. And now the giant was about to bring the whole mountain crashing down on top of them. The dawn broke on a new day, but for Ascend Air, it was the beginning of an endless night. The financial storm that Elias Vance had so quietly seeded had, with the help of viral outrage, grown into a Category 5 hurricane. It made landfall on Wall Street the moment the opening bell rang. Ascend Air's stock ticker symbol, ASCN, didn't just drop. It plummeted. It fell off a cliff, opening down 70%. Trading was halted within the first 5 minutes due to extreme volatility. When it resumed, the sell-off continued, a frantic digital massacre fueled by blind panic. Harrison Croft, watching the ticker on a screen in his office, felt like he was watching a live broadcast of his own execution. The first official blow came not from a press release, but from a quiet, devastatingly simple filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Oak Haven Capital announced it was re-evaluating its entire portfolio of transportation infrastructure debt, citing concerns over the operational stability and brand reputation of key lessees. They didn't mention Ascend Air by name. They didn't have to. The market understood the message perfectly. It was a formal public vote of no confidence from one of the most respected financial institutions on the planet. That was the signal Sterling Infrastructure Group had been dreading. Their own credit rating was immediately put on review for a downgrade. Their own investors began to panic. To save themselves, they had to cut the source of the infection. Before noon, Sterling's lawyers sent a formal notice to Ascend Air. They were in breach of the reputational risk clause in their leasing agreements. All lease financing was suspended effective immediately. They demanded the immediate grounding of all 160 aircraft they leased to the airline until the situation was resolved. It was a death sentence. An airline without planes is just a failing travel agency. News outlets, which had been feasting on the human interest angle of the story, now pivoted to the spectacular financial collapse. Headlines blared across the internet, from viral video to financial vortex, how Ascend Air lost 90% of its value in 12 hours. The Vance Effect. Silicon Valley Titans Airport ordeal grounds entire airline. Analysis Ascend Air's collapse. A case study in the perils of poor corporate culture. Inside the airline's headquarters, chaos reigned. The carefully constructed corporate artifice had shattered, revealing the raw, ugly fear beneath. Employees huddled in cubicles, endlessly refreshing news sites whispering about the future. The PR department had gone silent, their pre-written apologies now laughably inadequate. The finance department was fielding apocalyptic calls from creditors and banks. Harrison Croft was a man besieged. He spent the day in frantic, fruitless damage control. He tried to call Elias Vance directly, but was met by a polite but impenetrable wall of executive assistants. He left groveling voicemails that were never returned. He tried to contact Arthur Pembroke at Oakhaven, who refused to take his call. He appeared on a financial news network, his face pale and sweaty under the studio lights, and offered a rambling, desperate apology. He announced that both Cynthia Rowe and Robert Henderson had been fired, throwing them under the bus in a last-ditch effort to appease the mob. But it was too little far too late. The public wasn't interested in his apology. They saw it as the pathetic plea of a man who was sorry not for the offense, but for the consequences. The story was no longer just about Vance. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or mistreated by a person in a uniform. Elias had become a symbol. For Cynthia Rowe, the freefall was personal and brutal. Her name and face were everywhere. She was doxxed by online vigilantes, her address and phone number posted on dark corners of the internet. She received a torrent of hateful messages and threats. News vans parked outside her modest suburban home. Fired and disgraced, she became a recluse, her front blinds drawn, her phone silenced. Her 15 minutes of fame were an eternity in hell. Her casual cruelty, an act that took only moments, had cost her everything: her job, her reputation, and her peace of mind. Robert Henderson fared little better. His name was now inextricably linked with corporate failure and managerial incompetence. His LinkedIn profile was flooded with abusive comments. He tried to scrub his online presence, but the internet never forgets. He was a pariah in the industry. Every cautious career-building step he had taken over 20 years had been erased by 5 minutes of spineless decision-making. He had chosen the easy path of siding with his employee over a customer, and that path had led him right off a cliff. By the end of the day, the situation was irretrievable. Fuel suppliers, fearing they would not be paid, were demanding cash up front for refueling, which Ascend Air did not have. Airport authorities were threatening to seize aircraft to cover unpaid landing fees. The pilots' union was advising its members to prepare for mass layoffs. The freefall was absolute. In less than 24 hours, Ascend Air had gone from a functioning, if mediocre, airline to a worthless, grounded shell. It was a corporate implosion of historic speed and scale. Harrison Croft sat alone in his vast, silent office as evening fell, the cityscape twinkling outside his window. He had built this airline, steered it through recessions and fuel crises. He had always believed that the cold, hard numbers of finance were all that mattered. But he had learned in the most savage way possible that things like dignity, respect, and character were not just soft skills. They were assets. And by allowing a culture where those assets were worthless, he had ensured his own bankruptcy. The karma was no longer abstract. It was a set of numbers on a screen, each one a nail in his company's coffin. 1 week later, the official announcement came. In a sterile press release filled with phrases like unforeseen market pressures and insurmountable financial headwinds, Ascend Air filed for Chapter 7. Bankruptcy. It wasn't a reorganization, it was a liquidation. The company was not being saved, it was being dismantled and sold for parts. The final landing was not on a runway, but in a graveyard of failed corporations. The news was the lead story on every major network. Images of Ascend Air's grounded planes sitting idle on tarmacs across the country became the defining visual of the saga. Their bright, cheerful logos seemed to mock the corporate carcass they were attached to. Thousands of employees, pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, administrators were officially out of a job. The ripple effect of Cynthia Rose and Robert Henderson's actions had widened into a tidal wave, washing away the livelihoods of people who had no part in the initial incident. In the media, Harrison Croft became the poster child for executive hubris. He was forced to sell his mansions and his yacht to satisfy creditors. His name became a cautionary tale in business schools, a synonym for a CEO who was fatally disconnected from both his customers and his company's culture. The story of Elias Vance became legend in the worlds of finance and tech. He was lauded as a champion of justice, a man who had used his immense power to deliver a swift and decisive blow against corporate prejudice. He received thousands of emails and letters from people sharing their own stories of mistreatment, thanking him for standing up. But Elias himself remained silent. He gave no interviews. He issued no statements. He did not celebrate the demise of Ascend Air. To him, it was not a victory, but a tragedy, a necessary systemic course correction, but a tragedy nonetheless. He took no pleasure in the thousands of jobs lost, but he knew that a system built on a faulty foundation was bound to collapse. He had merely exposed the cracks, and the structure had crumbled under the weight of its own failings. 2 months after Ascend Air ceased to exist, Elias was in a different kind of terminal. It wasn't an airport, but the bright, airy lobby of a startup incubator in downtown Denver. He had, after the incident, chartered a private jet to make it to his old professor's home. They had spent a quiet weekend talking about theoretical physics and the beauty of cosmic background radiation, a welcome antidote to the ugliness of corporate society. Now, he was back in his element. He sat across a polished concrete table from a young, brilliant entrepreneur, a woman of color who had developed a revolutionary AI-driven platform for connecting underserved communities with educational resources. Her idea was groundbreaking, but traditional venture capital firms had dismissed her, unable to see past her youth and her background. Elias saw the future. He listened intently, his gaze focused, his questions sharp and insightful. He saw the same spark in her that Dr. Peterson had once seen in him. After she finished her presentation, her voice trembling slightly, with a mixture of passion and nerves, Elias smiled. It was a genuine, warm smile that transformed his usually serious features. "Your capital structure is inefficient," he said, not as a criticism, but as an observation. "And your 5-year growth projection is too modest. You're thinking too small." He slid a tablet across the table. On the screen was a term sheet. The funding amount Oak Haven Capital was offering was 10 times what she had asked for. Her eyes widened and tears welled up. "We believe in investing in people," Elias said softly. "We believe in building things that last. And we believe the culture you build is the single most important asset you will ever have. Get that right, and the rest will follow." A news report was playing on a television screen mounted on the wall behind them. It was a follow-up piece on the Ascend Air collapse, showing footage of their planes being stripped of their logos. Elias glanced at the screen for a brief moment, his expression unreadable, then turned his attention back to the young founder. He had not sought revenge. He had simply acted in accordance with his own principles. He had divested from a culture of decay and invested in a culture of growth. The karma that had struck Ascend Air was not a mystical force. It was the logical, inevitable consequence of their own actions. They had chosen to devalue a human being, and in doing so had rendered their entire enterprise worthless. Elias Vance, the quiet man in the hoodie, had not brought them down. He had simply stepped out of the way and allowed them to collapse, clearing the path for something new, something better to be built in its place. The final landing of Ascend Air was not an ending, but a clearing of the ground for a new takeoff. The story of Dr. Elias Vance and Ascend Air is a stark reminder that in our interconnected world, every action has a consequence. It's a testament to the fact that true power isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about the unshakable integrity of your character. A simple act of disrespect born from prejudice and arrogance didn't just cause a scene at an airport gate. It triggered a chain reaction that exposed the rotten core of a massive corporation, leading to its complete and utter demise. This is the ultimate story of karmic justice, where the scales were balanced not by magic, but by the cold, hard logic of finance and the undeniable power of public opinion. If this story of karmic justice resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up to help us share it with more people. What are your thoughts on the events that transpired? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more gripping stories about consequences, justice, and the hidden powers that shape our world, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Thanks for listening.